Now, I gotta admit, I wasn't sure I'd ever find a project car that could follow the Ferrari and captivate you guys like the Ferrari has. Admittedly, it's a unique project. But with that said, I'm not interested in chasing views. I'm gonna build what I wanna build, and if the views taper off, so be it. Which is why I am so surprised and thrilled by the response of the Audi unveiling video. It blew every expectation I had out of the water, and I am so thrilled to have this outlet and to have you guys along for the ride. And I'm also excited by the fact that I don't really know much about this car. I mean, I can tell you that it looks really cool and I can tell you about its history, but I don't know how it goes together, how it comes apart, or how it really works. So there's a learning curve here, and I have a feeling you guys are gonna teach me something along the way. So let's dive into this project. Let's figure out what's wrong with the Audi first and foremost, and then let's talk about what engine we're gonna stick in this thing's place. When I announced this build a bit over a week ago, I mentioned that the only way I could actually afford it is because the engine under the hood is hurt, as evidenced by the fact that there is coolant blowing out of the coolant bottle and landing everywhere. Chances are it's just a blown head gasket or maybe a cracked head, but when I bought the car, I also bought a Leakdown testing kit. Now, although we don't plan on keeping this engine, I definitely want to know what's wrong with it before we go tearing the entire car apart. Because it runs, we're able to do a Leakdown test and learn a little bit more about it. As you might guess, this particular Leakdown tester wasn't cheap, and I've been waiting for 9 months to use it, so let's go test this thing. The only problem is, we're hitting a roadblock before we even get started. We need to be able to turn the engine over with the crank nut, but with the engine sitting so far forward, there's no way we're getting tools down into the front of this engine bay. I can't even get my fingers down there, let alone a big socket wrench. So as I should have expected with working on an Audi, we've got to disassemble the entire front end just to do a simple job. Being an 80s car from Germany, I made the assumption that it would be easy to work on, kind of like my old BMWs, but I was clearly wrong. I got the grille out of the way and undid a bunch of screws, only to find that the bumper surround was no closer to coming off, and this was going to take quite a bit of work. Now, to be clear, once you've done this before, I'm sure this job would only take 30 minutes or so, but as said in the intro, I have absolutely no idea how this car comes apart. At one point, I realized, of course, they'd put the bolts for the bumper behind the lights. That would be clever and simple, but no, that was wrong too, of course. Instead, it was probably 20 or so screws holding the thing on, all of them somewhat difficult to reach, but eventually we got the front end taken apart and finally got access to that pesky front crank bolt which we need to turn the engine over for our Leakdown test. To be clear though, the Audi silliness didn't stop there. That front crank bolt is a 27mm socket, and I was lucky enough to have one, but man, what an annoyance it'd be to have to go out and buy one just for this job. But at this point, it's time to fire the Audi up and get it up to operating temp, so the engine seals nicely and we can do our test. Although I'm not really sure we need to do the test because, I don't know, something gives me a feeling that there's a problem. With how the bumper removal went, I got a taste of what working on this car might be like and thought about closing myself inside with the car just to kind of end the build already, but then I realized we're not going to get the fun of actually driving it someday, so I left the shop door open, and as you can see, this thing made a huge mess. Honestly, the lighting was pretty sick, and I wouldn't mind keeping this thing around for the express purpose of fogging up the shop, but working on it might be a little bit more fun. As per the firing order, we're starting with cylinder 1, and I'm using a long socket extension to find top dead center of the compression stroke. You've got to get it just right though, because if you miss your mark, when you pressurize the cylinder with air, you're going to send the piston right back down and have to start the process over. Now, plenty of you guys are undoubtedly familiar with a Leakdown test and what its purpose is, but for those that aren't, think of it as an advanced compression check. But instead of telling you how much compression the engine has, it tells you how much air leaks out of it. Cylinder number 1 is telling us that it has about 23% leak down, meaning 23% of the air we're pumping in is escaping from somewhere. Now, if we remove the oil cap, the dipstick, the coolant cap, and pretty much everything else, we can tell in this case that it's coming from the crankcase. We've got quite a bit of blow-by. Not surprising given the smoke. 23% isn't ideal, but it would run fine. It wasn't until we got to cylinder number 4 that we found the real problem. 82% of the air was escaping, meaning this thing wasn't making hardly any compression on this cylinder, and the air was escaping through cylinder number 5 and vice versa for 5 to 4. Cylinder number 3 looked good as well, which means we've probably got a blown head gasket or potentially a cracked cylinder head between cylinders 4 and 5. We'd probably also identify blow-by with air coming out of the crankcase if I put the spark plugs back in those cylinders to test, but honestly, we've identified enough to just go on and move forward. This engine is hurt. So we've got pretty bad leak down on 2 cylinders and not good leak down on another. It's exactly what I expected to find here. This is not surprising. I bought this car knowing we were gonna have some pretty serious engine issues, and I was excited to buy a car that was broken. I mean, I couldn't have bought this car otherwise. Their values are a bit too high for me. But this is a good thing, because within like 2 days of buying this Audi a whole year ago, I went out and bought an engine to swap into it. I knew what was coming. So let's talk about the plans. So here's the thing. If you know me, you know I love weird engine swaps. My E28 had a 1JZ under the hood, my first hot rod had a BMW V8, my Land Cruiser had a Chevy LS, and of course, as you guys know, we're in the middle of swapping a Honda engine into a Ferrari. So hold on to your seats or grab your pitchforks. Some of you will love this and some will hate it. I have decided to swap in an Audi engine. Now I know it's no V10, it's no rotary, it's no K24, and I don't know what you expected, but this is definitely the right engine for this car. Hear me out. There are very few production cars that ever came with a 5-cylinder, and it's part of what makes the Audi Quattro such a unique machine. Not only are these engines known for being absolutely bomb-proof, they're also absolute powerhouses. Guys have been making 1,000 horsepower from these engines for decades. Frankly, the engine is an integral part of what the Audi is. And more important than any of that is the sound. And you might say, oh, but Mike, that's a race car. No, they all sound sick. The 5-cylinder engine is a big part of why I bought this car, and so as an engine, I've decided to go with the AAN, one of the final versions of the iconic 20-valve turbo 5-cylinder engine. Now, a lot of you guys suggested to go with the 2.5-liter inline-5 from the new RS3, the TFSI engine, and honestly, that would be incredible if it weren't for the insane cost of entry. This was my original plan, but a dropout with 100,000 miles on it still fetches about $15,000 on eBay. So that's going to be a no for me, dog. Plus, I want the old school sound anyway. Now, looking at the engine that I wound up with, you might assume that it came from the bottom of the ocean, but no, it came from an RS2. But we're going to give this thing a complete rebuild in preparation for about 500 wheel horsepower. I didn't plan on buying an engine in this state, but this is what showed up sight unseen. And until today, I wasn't even aware of whether or not it turned over. But giving it the old crank, it does seem to have really good compression, despite the fact that the AC compressor sounds like it's grinding pepper. I'm told by a lot of people that we could just leave this engine alone, that it'll meet our power goals as it is, but given the state that it's in, I think it's due for a rebuild anyway. But in any case, I'm really happy with the engine that I've decided on, and I think it's just correct for the Quattro and what I want out of it. Now, as said, there are a lot of reasons I'd want to keep an Audi engine in this car, but let's actually turn the camera around and look at the physical constraints we'd face if we wanted to put a different engine in here. Now, obviously, we could do something like a 4-cylinder, a K-Series, or maybe even a VR6 that could bolt to the original transmission, and it wouldn't be that hard of a swap. But if we really wanted to go off the rails and to do something like an E92 M3 V8 and a DCT, which I thought about for a moment, there would be some serious challenges here. The first one is that if we wanted to retain the existing driveline and just change the engine, well, the engine is completely in front of the front wheels. There's hardly any room in front of the engine, and there's certainly no cooling stack in front of it because it sits off to the side. As a result, this would severely limit the number of engines you could just drop in with a transmission adapter. For most cars, you could just swap transmissions too, but there's no transmission tunnel on this car because the bell housing is in front of the firewall. The quote-unquote trans tunnel is really just sized for the tail of the transmission and the drive shaft. And then what really ices the cake of making an engine swap difficult, even if we were willing to cut a hole in the firewall for a transmission, is the fact that buried right behind this heat shield here is the steering rack. It's above and behind the engine. So the steering rack would definitely be in the way of having a traditional transmission and engine mounted in this car, not to mention the fact that there's not a normal subframe in this thing. So really, if you want to do an engine swap of that caliber, you're gonna have to convert the entire front end to something else. For example, putting an E36 front subframe into it with a steering rack, completely changing the suspension so that it'll steer properly, and then cutting the firewall up and the floor up so you can fit a transmission, and just making all of that work. Clearly, that's a big project. Now, it's something that I'm comfortable doing. That sounds pretty cool, but as said in the last episode, what I really want out of this car is something that I can drive all the time, a true kind of street car, something I could drive daily if I wanted to, and ideally something that isn't gonna take a year to complete. So, in the name of actually getting this car done on a timeline that isn't like the Ferrari, we're just gonna stick with that Audi motor. I think it makes more sense, and I know I'm gonna be happy with it. I'm really excited to experience that Audi 5-cylinder roar and that all-wheel horsepower. I've never had an all-wheel drive car before, and if we were to put something like a V8 in this thing with a normal transmission, we're definitely losing that all-wheel drive setup. The only real way to retain that would be to do something more akin to maybe like an RB with an all-wheel drive system from a Skyline, but I have no interest in converting this car into a Skyline underneath. At that point, I'm just gonna go buy an R32 GTR. So some of you guys are excited about that engine. Some of you guys are disappointed that it's not like a Gallardo V10 or something crazy. I don't know, doesn't really matter. I'm excited about it, but we have more than just an engine to swap into this thing. Hiding in the back of the shop in a lot of shots for a long time, I've had this guy standing here, and I thought somebody would recognize it. I included it in shots of the shear and while using the brake and things like that until I moved it over here. But we've got an 01E 6-speed transmission, so we're gonna convert to a 6-speed, and I went with this transmission because from the research I've done, it's more or less the most bulletproof option we can just bolt into this car, and I wanna be able to drive this thing really hard. We've also got a matching rear diff. Since it's all-wheel drive, we've gotta make sure our final drive ratios match each other, but we're gonna swap these in when we do the engine, but as you guys can see, this thing is quite crusty, just like the engine is, so we're gonna do a little bit of refurbishing, because it's ugly and I don't want it to go in the car that way. All right, guys, that is all I have for you today. I hope you have enjoyed the first Audi episode, and whether you're looking forward to what's to come or even if you're not, I hope you'll come back and keep watching, because I promise to make these episodes the same high quality content you're used to seeing here. I pour my heart and soul into this stuff. So if you haven't subscribed yet, you should. It helps me out a bunch. Your subscriptions, your likes, and those comments are what make this channel work and keep the roof over my head and keep me producing videos just like this one. With all that said, I'll catch you guys next week. I've got some cool E36 parts that have shown up. I'm thinking about perhaps doing a carbon airbox versus open velocity stack test episode. Should be pretty cool. And of course, some Ferrari content that I'll be chipping away at. I'll catch you guys then. Thanks as always for the support.